Before I begin, I'm going to tell you how we are going to finish. I'll give you a glimpse of how documentation is managed in a large open source community, the WordPress community. I'll add a few tips and make a couple of strong points on the importance of documenting everything. If you haven't been documenting anything before, you'll agree and find it quite relatable because I'm skilled in making strong points. And I have some really good memes. You'll even ask a few questions or maybe start reading some of the pages I recommend. You make plans how from now on, everything you work on will be documented. And tomorrow, you'll go back to old non-documentation life. Unless you are already a member of an open source community or considering becoming one, and there's no handbook on how to be a member of that community. Or you're trying to use this open source software in your project, but the latest version in documentation is 3 major versions ago. Or you're developing this magnificent software and you made it open source and set a license to allow everyone to use it, but it just doesn't get any contributions from random good people as it should. It's open source for Christine's sake. Now that we have established who this presentation is for, I hope the rest of you will want to try one of these roles by the end of the presentation itself. Being a part of an open source community is both liberating and enslaving. You're gonna love it. But first, let me address a few misconceptions regarding documentation itself. Code should be self-documented. This kind of thinking is rather elitistic and creates a community in a bubble. You are inviting only developers and only those developers who can understand your code and the structure of your project. You're really inviting yourself. And you are missing out on different use cases for your project, new features, new contributors. You're limiting the growth of your project in every possible way. The next one, it's obvious how to use our software. Users will know. This one is so funny and simply not true. Even if your software is yet another email client, there will always be enough new users who will not know how to navigate it and will not use it properly. And being both developer and documentarian, this is probably my favorite. Real developers write code and have no time for docs. If you try to write the docs, you'd know just how in-depth you need to understand the software and how many skills you need to be able to pass that knowledge. And once you try and realize this, you'll know for a fact that only real developers can write software developer docs. Besides, writing documentation is like exercising. Everybody should do it for at least half an hour a day. But if you really don't have that time, you should do it for an hour. And these are just few, many, we don't have time for all the misconceptions. And of course, there are many challenges. Once you decide to write documentation, it's never finished. That's something to make peace with. It is never finished, and you really have to commit to it. But this is how the world looks like without documentation. It is interesting, but not very useful. And this user obviously knows how to use this device, right? And regardless of how many people are happy without documentation, there will always be those few never satisfied, always wanting more, and they will write it vigorously. Anyhow, open source communities. My first encounter with WordPress was in September 2009, and my first contribution to its documentation was a year and a half later on May 12, 2011. Besides many tutorials found online from the very beginning, I was using the existing docs to assist my reckless development in local environment. But then I found some features and behaviors in my local WordPress that weren't documented. What? Me being hold my beer type of person couldn't stand this oversight, so I documented it. But it was easy to contribute in 2011. Early WordPress documentation, also known as Codex, was built on Wiki, which has both good and bad sides. So this means that anyone with WordPress.org account can edit any page. All you need is this one account at WordPress.org. And there is even a history of every edit, so you know exactly what happened and when. So even a small piece of contributions from each member will build a great documentation in no time, right? When you think of it, Wiki does sound like a perfect tool for collaborating on open source documentation. The only problem with this is that anyone with WordPress.org account can edit any page. Can you imagine everyone, 12.7 million people, being able to edit any page? Project grew, gained more attention, and more spam. It's a maintenance nightmare. The solution was getting more control over who has access to it. So the tool had to be changed. And really, what's a better tool than the one we were building? WordPress. So the migration of content was set in motion. The first heavy load was differentiating the end user documentation from developers documentation, making sort of catalogs and then start moving it. And by moving, I mean copy pasting manually. Many Google spreadsheets, and a few years later, it was completed. Almost. But by fixing this one problem, which is spam and unwanted edits, another problem was created. It wasn't easy to contribute anymore. And when it's not easy to contribute, people stop contributing. Well, not me. When I realized there was documentation I couldn't edit anymore, I dug deeper to find out who did this. And I found them. They're this group of people that call themselves WordPress documentation team, and they were making all these decisions about how documentation is going to look like and who can change it. Well, I like making decisions too. So I joined them in September 2016. So now in order to contribute, besides WordPress.org account, you need WordPress Slack account to communicate with documentation team. And then they might give you access to the WordPress dashboard where documentation is written. And while we want to encourage people to contribute, we have to be mindful of the unwanted edits and possible mistakes because that's the problem we wanted to fix. So granting access is a fine line and definitely a bottleneck, but that's not all. This new workflow created a need for a place where people can report issues. These kinds of changes in community dynamics require the ability to scale, to recognize the problem, and flexibility to adapt quickly, all of which we didn't do for a long time. Besides the need for these two accounts, WordPress.org and Slack, potential contributors now needed to know how and where to report the issues they found. And this is a good moment to introduce you to different parts of WordPress documentation. Now, the best part, the best thing you can do when leading the team, especially open source team, is to delegate responsibilities. So all these projects that you are going to see have their own representatives or project leads. They are the people who are reporting on progress for that project on our weekly meetings. If you have any questions about project or you want to get involved, these are the people you would talk to directly. And they have the freedom of choosing the tools they're using for managing their projects. So we ended up with a different workflow for reporting and fixing issues for almost every project we have. Here we go. End user documentation, also called Help Hub internally, is located next to support forums, a place where a user would go to ask for help. It's split in two parts, general and block editor and user documentation. There is no visible difference between the two, except that block editor articles will have changelog at the bottom of the page. The real difference was behind the scenes, people who maintain it and the tools they were using. General and user documentation is created mostly in Google Documents because anyone can have access to it, and then pasted into WordPress editor. Below each article is a text area which is intended to be used for reporting issues and giving feedback about articles. The problem here is that people use this text area for different things, such as asking questions about how to use WordPress. So these questions should be actually in support forums. And also we get a nice share of spam. So we need a person who's going to triage all the feedback and separate actual issues from everything else. But mainly, issues for end user documentation are reported in our Slack channel. Progress and task management was mainly done in Google Spreadsheet. Being on the same WordPress install, block editor and user documentation is created the same way general docs is in Google Documents, and they're also using the same feedback text area, but most of the issues are also reported in Slack. However, block editor's development is extremely fast compared to the rest of the WordPress. Release cycles are 2 weeks long, and end user documentation team is trying to follow this tempo. They were using Google Docs for collecting release changes and Trello board for managing work on documenting these changes. And because WordPress is using both GitHub and SVN for development and issue tracking, the block editor and user docs team is spending a lot of time going through these tickets as well. Developer documentation, internally called DevHub, whose link we securely hid in the footer, is located at developer.wordpress.org and consists of 8 different handbooks at the moment, but we are looking at the new one very soon, and 5 of which are maintained by the documentation team. Code reference is a specific handbook because the large part of it is generated from the code itself. There is a script that goes through all core files, collects every function, class, and hook, and creates a page in WordPress for it. Description, parameters, changelog, what it returns, where it is used, since when it exists, and similar info is also extracted from the code, actually from code comments, or as we call it, inline documentation. However, this is only for PHP code. We still don't have this kind of documentation for JavaScript part of WordPress. The other parts of these pages that are not generated from the code, such as additional info and user contributed notes, are created directly in WordPress. Additional info in dashboard and user contributed notes are in fact comments. And since these comments are mostly code examples, they're held for review by the documentation team. So this handbook is really a hybrid type, and reporting issue for it, here comes the fun part, depends on which part of the page you found the issue. If it's the part generated from code, you have to open track ticket as you would for any issue with the code itself. But if the problem is with parts managed from WordPress, then the issue should be reported in our Slack channel. And this is a great moment to ask yourself, if someone was just reading the page and found an issue with it, how do they know which part is created where? And more importantly, why would they care? Block editor, also known as Gutenberg, is the newest, bigger project in WordPress, and that can be seen in tools the team is using, such as Webpack over Grunt, which can be found in older WordPress projects. Documentation itself is created in the same GitHub repository by using Markdown files, which are then parsed into WordPress pages with another script. We love those scripts. Reporting issues with this part of documentation is done in the editor's GitHub repository, so it's pretty much clean and straightforward. The remaining 3, common APIs, themes, and plugins handbook, are managed the same way as general end user documentation, directly in WordPress dashboard, and the issues are usually reported in our Slack channel. We do plan to add text area for the feedback here, the same we had it for end user documentation. And there is contributor documentation. Each team that is making WordPress has their own blog and handbook for contributors and team members. All of this is located at make.wordpress.org, and each team has regular meetings, so blog is the place for meeting agendas and summaries, while handbooks are used for explaining what the team is working on, who are members, and how to get involved. So this is the place for documenting contribution processes. So yeah, These are all WordPress documentation projects, and that's how you would report any issue with it. I know how to report issues for all these projects only because I have repeated this so many times to anyone who showed the slightest interest in getting involved. And I've got from them this face you are seeing right now, which is somewhat understandable. And when repetition became too much, we wrote it down in our handbook, even recorded videos. But even then, we've been getting feedback how difficult and confusing it is to get involved with documentation team. Again, we needed to rethink our tools, but with a different set of criteria this time. The perfect tool doesn't exist yet, but here are some parameters to consider when choosing one. So ideally, people should be able to report issue on the spot without ever leaving the page or being required to do anything else, such as creating a new account, searching through some other platform, or reading guidelines about where and how to report the issue. There are two types of contributors reporting the issues: those who report it and just move along, and those who report it and want to fix it. Those who just want to report it should never, ever know the workflow between the place where the issue is found and the place where the issue is fixed. And while we really want to make it easy for people to report the issue, we don't want to make additional work for active contributors who are going to fix those issues. When issues are reported in Slack channel, that's additional work for team members because someone needs to make sure that report doesn't get lost in Slack noise by either copying it somewhere else or fixing it right away. Also, if the tool or the workflow is complicated, that's additional work for experienced contributors to explain it to every new contributor, unless you document your processes and keep that documentation up to date religiously. But even then, the workflow should really be as simple as possible. We are giving our free time to these projects and it shouldn't be frustrating. And this is really a no-brainer. Anything that can be documented, anything that you're going to do more than once should be automated. And open source projects have a lot of things that can be automated, but really all that comes down to getting enough, but not too many notifications about uh, exactly what has to be done and where at the right time in right place. You see, in a project as large as WordPress is, the most difficult thing is to be informed of what other teams are doing and what's generally happening in community. The more active you are in one team, the less you are aware of the rest of the project. And as I said, the perfect tool doesn't exist, so we joined more teams that have the same needs, such as marketing, training, and learning teams, and we are going to build this perfect tool for WordPress.org. And this is still in progress, so I can't say anything more at the moment. Meanwhile, we decided to use GitHub as a central place for reporting all documentation issues until our custom perfect tool is ready. And there are several arguments behind this decision. Even though this is yet another account contributors need in order to contribute, we have removed the burden of having to know workflow for reporting issues. And other tools we used, Trello and Google Spreadsheets, are replaced with GitHub issues and GitHub projects. And in future, we are going to use custom integration with GitHub, where people will be able to report issues on the spot, and GitHub API will automatically open new issues, label them properly, and send all the necessary notifications. Next, contributors who want to fix issues don't have to decide which part of documentation they want to work with. They can just go to GitHub repository, find issues they like, and start working on it. And in the future, we hope to move as much as possible documentation to GitHub, which would remove the maintenance bottleneck with granting access and provide proper version control. Also, in WordPress community, we like to give credits to people for every contribution, even the smallest one. However, if that contribution is done in Slack, either by reporting issues and passing by, or by participating in discussion, it's hard to catch all the usernames and thank them properly. With GitHub as a place for reporting, discussing, and assigning issues, we hope to finally be able to track all contributors and their contributions. And when we talk about WordPress documentation, we can't skip Gutenberg. This is a living example of how lack of proper documentation can slow down the progress of open source projects. For those of you who don't know, Gutenberg is a new editing experience for WordPress. Well, not so new anymore, but it is still being avoided by many developers and site builders. At the beginning, it was just replacing the what you see is what you get editor, and more recently, it is expanding to a full site editing experience. So, what is wrong with Gutenberg? Well, it's not wrong, but it's a problem. Gutenberg is based on React, but not just that. There is the PHP layer of WordPress as we know it, and the React layer as a base of Gutenberg. But there is also a mixed PHP and React layer, which is Gutenberg. In order to document it, we need people who understand all three layers in depth, but those people are rare and they were busy writing the code. So we let Gutenberg be merged in core without documentation being adapted for PHP developers, which is the majority of WordPress developers. This resulted in frustrated users who refused to use Gutenberg. And in WordPress, it is a common practice. When something is new, someone will write the plugin to undo the change. We are used to that. But this was much bigger. This change provoked even forking of pre-Gutenberg WordPress. So when you have this large change in code base and this strong rejection by your users, you inevitably create two streams. One stream keeps working on code to make it better, more attractive, more useful, more acceptable. The other stream keeps rejecting it because they have no place to learn from. But this stream is also seeing more progress and realizing just how much more they are behind each day. So the frustration grows. Less and less people are capable of writing documentation for it, and then we face documentation debt. So how do you move from here? How do you fix this? Very slowly. However weird it may sound, the best documentation is written by those who are using it. And this is true for all documentation. Let people go through it and point to places where it stops making sense. Give them missing information, and if they're not too frustrated, they might fill in the gaps. And you have converted documentation user into a documentation writer. Congratulations. So, as you see, it's not perfect. It's very far from it. WordPress as a project grew faster than we realized we need to adapt. There was a time when different teams could do their jobs separately, but now, actually for a while now, we see our needs overlapping. We feel the necessity to communicate more, to share tools and workflows. And I think this state is partly due to our inertia. We join open source projects, learn how to be a good member, and try to keep it working the way it did before. It can be scary to propose something new to a project as large as WordPress is. WordPress is covering over 40% of the internet. There is a specific kind of pressure in keeping that in mind, not to mention how slow decisions are made. The bigger project, the slower movement. Sometimes we need months just to make one decision. And this is what WordPress documentation team is doing to move things forward. So 2 WordPress documentation projects were selected for Google Season of Docs project in 2020, during which we collaborated with technical writers who helped us create official documentation style guide and improve end user documentation. We are happy that these technical writers loved our community and decided to stay as active contributors. It might be hard to believe, but the documentation team was never really involved in WordPress releases. I was loudly unhappy about that. So I took documentation focus lead role for WordPress 5.8 in order to learn the process and see how documentation team can be more involved in the future. So in 5.8, I started doing regular release reports during the documentation team meetings and asking for volunteers. In 5.9, I was co-leading in order to assist another person going through the process. We switched from tracking progress in Google Spreadsheets to those new shiny GitHub projects. And that's really convenient because when you create project under the organization, as we did under WordPress organization, then you can add to this project any issue or pull request from any repository inside that organization. And I continued reporting release progress and asking for volunteers in the documentation team meetings. And now we are in the middle of 6.0 release cycle, and I'm also co-leading with another persons. And now, beside these GitHub projects and my constant reports to documentation team, we also have Zoom meetings and plan of actions. And I plan to stay close to releases until we develop workflow that is sustainable, not too heavy load on contributors, reaching everyone it should reach, and most importantly, fully documented so people can easily take over. And as I said, we are working together with learning, training, and marketing teams to build the perfect tool for keeping up with changes in WordPress releases and simplify contributing processes while automating everything that can be automated. And this one I'm really excited about. We are trying to start a new workflow where every developer working on code, especially new feature, will have a dedicated documentarian who'll follow along, ask questions, and document everything while it's being developed. We want to stop releasing undocumented code. And at the moment, of course, we don't have enough people for that, but we hope that the fact you'll be working closely with experienced developers would attract more contributors in near future. And always document processes because the bust factor is real and transparency is the only way to keep open source alive. And keep in mind, there is no documentation on things, how to do things when open source projects expand in this capacity and time frame. We are the ones who have to rethink workflows and tools, who have to make faster decisions based on ever-changing requirements we come across. We have to stop reacting and start leading the open source evolution, and we are the ones who have to document all of that for the future. If you want to learn more about open source and documentation, I can highly recommend these resources. And I would like to invite you to join WordPress community at make.wordpress.org. I personally am always offering cookies for documentation contributors. My name is Milana. I am WordPress engineer at XWP and one of the representatives for the WordPress documentation team. My company is hiring at the moment, so if you want to work with me or have any questions about the company, feel free to contact me through any of these channels. It has been a great pleasure to be here, and I hope you'll discover and embrace those inner documentarians of yours. And thank you very much for your time.